there's a part of Western history that almost no one talks about. A part carefully trimmed out of our school textbooks, polished away from patriotic stories, and replaced with sentimental tales about exploration, bravery, and innovation. But if you peel back those layers, if you dare to look behind the wealth and the prestige, you find a darker engine powering the rise of nations. Drugs, not the underground narcotics we associate with modern criminal cartels, but state-protected, government-endorsed, profit-driven drug empires that operated in broad daylight. Before we get into it, do me a favor and leave a comment below telling us which country you're rewatching this from. Always curious to see how far these messages are reaching. Now, what you're about to hear is not a conspiracy, not an exaggeration, and not some fringe theory. It's history, just not the version you were probably taught in school. The truth is that Western power, Western wealth, and what we call Western civilization were all deeply shaped by the opium trade. Entire family fortunes were born from it. Global corporations rose on its profits. And major political dynasties, including some still revered, their early success to money earned through addiction, exploitation, and international drug trafficking. This story begins long before the modern era, long before the opioid crisis or fentanyl labs. It starts with the British Empire and the East India Company, one of the most powerful corporate entities ever created, with its own private army, its own ships, its own laws, and the full backing of the British Crown. The East India Company essentially became the world's first multinational drug cartel. They didn't just trade opium, they weaponized it. They used it strategically to weaken China, dominate markets, and build unbelievable financial empires back home in London. And at the time, this wasn't seen as shameful. It was seen as profitable, efficient, and politically useful. British merchants grew opium in India, shipped it in massive quantities, and forced it onto Chinese markets even when the Chinese government begged them to stop. When China finally resisted, Britain didn't negotiate. They went to war. Twice! These weren't heroic battles. They were drug wars, literal wars, fought to defend the right of Western traders to sell narcotics. When students learn about the Opium Wars, they often hear these sterile academic descriptions: trade imbalance, economic tensions, conflict over imports. These sanitized phrases hide the brutal truth. Western powers were flooding China with addictive substances, destroying millions of lives, and then using military force to protect their business. The profits were immense. This money flowed back into British banks, into aristocratic estates, into political campaigns, and into educational institutions. The money built infrastructure, funded railroads, supported the Royal Navy, and created fortunes that still exist today. Many of the families who gained from this era remained at the elite level of Western society, though you'll rarely find the real origin of their wealth mentioned in their official biography. But Britain wasn't alone. The Dutch East India Company, another one of the world's earliest multinational corporations, ran its own vast drug network. They trafficked opium across Southeast Asia with a level of organization that would make any modern cartel envious. And just like the British, they protected their trade with naval power and political influence. The Dutch royal family, the merchant classes, and European financiers all benefited from a system that depended on addiction as its primary source of revenue. This is the part of history that feels almost unbelievable, not because it's exaggerated, but because it was hidden so effectively. Western nations built their global influence using a strategy that today would be considered criminal at every single level. They destabilized other cultures, spread dependence, and then used the resulting chaos to seize control of trade, territory, and political power. And then we come to America. A lot of people daren't know that elite American families were directly involved in the opium business. We imagine early America as a place of Puritans, farmers, and industrial pioneers. But several of the wealthiest dynasties made their money in the China trade, which is just another one of those sanitized historical phrases, in many cases. The China trade meant one thing: Opium. One of the most famous examples is the Delano family, the ancestors of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR's grandfather, Warren Delano II, wasn't a small-time player. He ran major operations in Canton, managed powerful trading houses, and after losing his fortune in a financial crash, he went right back to China to rebuild it through the opium trade. That money eventually funded an elite education, political access, and ultimately a presidency. And yet, you'll find almost no mention of this in most history books. The Roosevelts weren't the only ones. Many prominent East Coast families, whose names you'll see on universities, foundations, museums, and trust funds, were connected to the opium trade. Their descendants became senators, bankers, corporate leaders, and philanthropists. What started as drug money was laundered into legitimacy over generations long before modern money laundering laws even existed. This is why the concept of old money in America carries such a strange mystique. People imagine elegance, propriety, and tradition, but behind much of that tradition lies a very different story. A story of ships filled with narcotics. A story of foreign suffering turned into domestic wealth. A story of addiction used as a tool for building an empire. The hypocrisy becomes even sharper when you consider how aggressively Western nations later enforced anti-drug laws that punished the poor, criminalized minorities, and devastated entire communities. While ordinary people went to prison for minor possession or low-level dealing, the original architects of the global drug economy were honored, celebrated, and immortalized. Their portraits hang in museums. Their names are carved onto buildings. Their legacies are taught as models of great leadership. This double standard isn't a coincidence. It's structural. The same systems that profited from these drug empires also shaped the laws that created criminals out of anyone who threatened their monopoly or challenged their sanitized version of history. This pattern becomes even clearer when you look at how Western governments and intelligence agencies behaved in the 20th century. During the Vietnam War and throughout the Cold War, there are countless rumors, testimonies, and declassified documents showing that drug routes were often protected or quietly tolerated when they served geopolitical interests. Some whistleblowers have even claimed that military planes carried more than just soldiers. Others have suggested that certain insurgent groups and paramilitary forces were allowed sometimes even operate drug operations as long as they aligned with Western strategic goals. And then there is Afghanistan. During America's long presence in the region, opium production didn't shrink, it skyrocketed. Poppy fields flourished, heroin exports surged, and local warlords became global suppliers. For many observers, the pattern was painfully familiar. Wherever Western powers sought to extend their influence, drug economies seemed to grow rather than disappear. Whether that was intentional or simply a byproduct of the chaos, the result was the same. Another region destabilized, another generation harmed, and another fortune made somewhere far, far away from the battlefield. But perhaps the most shocking chapter of all is the modern opioid crisis right here in the United States. This time, the dealers weren't foreign traders or colonial powers. They were pharmaceutical corporations. Companies that knowingly marketed highly addictive substances, downplayed the risks, and pressured doctors into mass prescribing them. Families were destroyed, communities collapsed, and millions of lives were altered forever. And once again, the profits were enormous. Just like in the 1800s, addiction became a business model. History repeats itself because the core incentives have never really changed. From the opium dens in 19th century China to the prescription pads in modern America, the pattern is the same. Powerful groups get richer, vulnerable populations suffer, and the truth gets buried behind legal jargon, patriotic stories, and a sanitized version of history that protects the powerful. It's a story we were never meant to hear, but one we can no longer afford to ignore. Thanks for watching. If this video opened your eyes, make sure to like and subscribe for more content that challenges the official story. See you in the next one. But the story doesn't end with pharmaceutical companies, political dynasties, or colonial empires. It goes deeper because the structures built during the age of opium never truly collapsed. They simply changed shape. They adapted. They evolved into more sophisticated systems, hidden inside modern financial networks, trade agreements, and corporate influence. The mechanics of profit remained identical, but the presentation became cleaner, more respectable, wrapped in the language of economics, healthcare, and national security. Today, the legacy of the Western drug empires reaches into every part of global society, even if most people never realize it. The financial institutions that once handled opium profits became modern banks. The families who grew rich from colonial drug trades became senators, governors, and philanthropists. The companies that learned to systematize addiction became pharmaceutical giants, and the political structures that once enforced drug monopolies with cannons and warships now enforce them through laws, sanctions, and regulatory agencies. This is why understanding the past is so important, because the systems we live under today were shaped by it. And the deeper you look, the more the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Consider how Western political narratives often portray themselves as defenders of morality, civilization, and justice. Yet these same governments once launched wars to protect drug profits. They defended corporations that destroyed foreign societies for financial gain. They built institutions on money extracted from suffering. They criminalized the very behaviors that their own ancestors institutionalized. And then they wrote the history books to make themselves look like the heroes. Think about how odd it is that most people can name mafia bosses from movies, yet they know almost nothing about the real global drug lords who shaped modern geopolitics, men who wore tailored suits, held government titles, and attended elite universities. They are missing from documentaries, ignored in school curriculums, and rarely mentioned even in higher education. Their descendants still walk among the world's most privileged circles, their reputations protected by silence and selective memory. Meanwhile, the consequences of their actions ripple through time. When China struggled with widespread addiction during the 19th century, it wasn't an organic tragedy. It was engineered by Western financial empire. When Asia's political landscape fractured, when families collapsed, when generations lost their futures, it was a direct result of deliberate policies designed for profit. These events are often framed as cultural decline or internal instability, but the real story is much simpler. Addiction was used as a weapon, and history has a strange way of balancing itself. In recent decades, the United States has faced its own waves of addiction, from heroin to opioids to fentanyl. Some call it karma, others call it geopolitical retaliation. But the truth is that the roots of these crises are tied to the same forces that fueled the old empires: profits, power, and political opportunism. Whether the drugs flowed into China in the 1800s or into America today, the mechanics of exploitation remain the same. Let's explore how these patterns play out across generations. During the 19th century, Western traders created the supply. They built the networks. They used military protection to guarantee profits. Later, during the 20th century, Western intelligence operations leveraged drug routes for strategic influence. Some insurgent groups were allegedly funded by narcotic sales, as long as their actions aligned with Western geopolitical interests. The public never knew. The press rarely questioned. And by the time the truth surfaced, it was already buried beneath decades of denial. Then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, pharmaceutical corporations entered the picture. They didn't need ships or private armies. They used medical journals, marketing teams, and lobbying groups. They created addiction not through illegal smuggling but through legal prescriptions. Doctors were pressured. Regulations were bent. Regulators were influenced, and millions of Americans found themselves trapped in a spiral of dependency that felt eerily similar to what Chinese families had experienced more than a century earlier. What connects all of these moments? Colonial opium, Cold War trafficking roots, pharmaceutical opioids is a single philosophical truth. Addiction has always been one of the most profitable industries on earth. And wherever there is profit on this scale, powerful institutions will protect it. This is why drug laws, enforcement policies, and political rhetoric often seem contradictory. Governments loudly declare a war on drugs, yet drugs continue to flood markets. Politicians claim to protect public health, yet prescription systems remain dangerously vulnerable to abuse. Corporations settle massive lawsuits, yet executives rarely face prison time. Small-time dealers are arrested, yet major distributors operate in corporate boardrooms. But it's not just hypocrisy, it's strategy. If you look closely, enforcement efforts typically target the lowest level of the ladder while leaving the top untouched. This creates the illusion of control while preserving the structure that generates profit. In the 1800s, British warships protected opium merchants. In the 1900s, intelligence agencies allegedly shielded strategic drug networks. In the 2000s, pharmaceutical lobbyists shielded companies selling addictive products. And in each era, those at the bottom suffered while those at the top prospered. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why drug empires never truly die. Simply rebrand. When opium became politically inconvenient, morphine hosey. When morphine became problematic, heroin replaced it. When heroin was criminalized, synthetic opioids appeared. When those became too exposed, new labs produced fentanyl. Each evolution was framed as a new crisis, yet each one followed the same blueprint written centuries earlier. Let's return to the broader global story. The expansion of Western wealth through drug profits also shaped international relations. China's weakened state in the 1800s contributed to internal rebellions, political fragmentation, and foreign invasions. This instability paved the way for the rise of competing powers in Asia, for the shifts that defined the 20th century, and for the complex geopolitics we see today. A single economic strategy forcing opium onto a foreign nation altered the trajectory of global history. The same is true of the Middle East and Central Asia. When war or foreign intervention destabilizes a region, illicit drug production often increases. Poppy fields thrive in conflict zones. Organized networks emerge where there is chaos, and global powers sometimes intentionally, sometimes inadvertently benefit from the outcomes. It happened in Afghanistan. It happened in Southeast Asia. It happened in Latin America. Drug economies and political strategies have always been intertwined. What makes the Western narrative particularly striking is how cleanly these histories are erased from public consciousness. Museums highlight art, architecture, and innovation, rarely the drug profits that funded them. Universities celebrate founders and benefactors, rarely the merchants and traders who built their fortunes through opium. Politicians celebrate national pride, rarely the international suffering that created their platforms. This isn't just selective storytelling. It's strategic. If people truly understood how deeply their world was shaped by drug empires, their view of history would change forever. They would see that the line between criminality and legitimacy is often just a matter of presentation. They would see that wealth is not always earned through ingenuity, but frequently through exploitation. They would see that the real global cartels were not gangs in alleyways, but boardrooms backed by governments and militaries. But perhaps the most important takeaway is this. History doesn't just reveal what happened. It reveals what is happening right now, because the same incentives, the same structures, and the same dynamics still shape global economics and politics today. We are living inside systems built by people who believed addiction was an acceptable price for wealth. And so the question becomes, what other industries today follow this same logic? What other products are marketed aggressively, despite known harms? What other corporations prioritize profit over human life? What other governments tolerate destruction because it benefits their strategic agenda? The past isn't distant, it's a mirror. And when you look into it, you begin to understand how power really works. The Western drug empires built the economic pillars of modern society, but they also built something else. A culture of selective memory, a culture that praises innovation while ignoring exploitation, a culture that celebrates prosperity while burying its origins, a culture that criminalizes the powerless while protecting the powerful. Until these truths are acknowledged, history will continue repeating itself in new forms. Today, as nations grapple with fentanyl, opioids, and synthetic drugs, we are not witnessing a new crisis. We are witnessing the next chapter of a very old story, a story written hundreds of years ago by merchants and governments who learned that controlling addiction was one of the fastest ways to shape the world. And just like before, the real question isn't who is using the drugs, it's who is profiting from them. Understanding this truth changes everything. It shifts the focus from individuals to institutions, from symptoms to structures, from isolated tragedies to systemic forces. And once you see the pattern, you begin to realize that the greatest empires in history weren't built on ideals, they were built on trade, and the most profitable trade of all was drugs. Thanks for watching. If this story changed how you see the world, be sure to subscribe for more content that challenges the official narrative. See you next time.